I say good evening because our guest is based in a time zone in which it is now evening. Good morning to most of you. I gather the majority of us are in the UK. And whether you're watching this live or catching up later through the recording, we're delighted to have you with us. Before we begin, I'd like to extend my very sincere thanks to those who have helped to make this event possible, in particular to Peter Hardy, Rick Finlay, Hugh Nathan, and Pete Griffiths, without whom we really wouldn't be gathered today in this way. Anyway, I now have the great pleasure, the very great pleasure, of introducing our guest speaker, Dr. Steve Georgakis. Dr. Georgakis joined the University of Sydney in 2002 and has since established himself as a leading figure in the fields of physical education and sport in schools, also in teacher education and in the history and sociology of sport. He's the author most recently and most saliently for our purposes today of Towards a Theoretical Understanding of Australian Colonial Sport. It's a highly readable volume in which he offers a fresh framework for interpreting the development of sport in Australia during the colonial period. He draws on case studies ranging from school football to community sports like horse racing, yachting, lawn bowls, and most important for our purposes, cricket, and on the basis of those case studies furnishes a very compelling account of sport as a vehicle for cultural continuity and national ideology in 19th century Australia. If he's free, I now invite you to join me in quite literally muted applause for our guest, Dr. Steve Georgakis.
Thank you for this presentation. Just some very quick background information there. I'm a great lover of cricket. I played cricket growing up. I run a course at the Sydney University, and we took 200 of our students this evening into the Sydney cricket ground, including a couple of friends of mine who were English, and we're out here for the Ashes Test series. When I was writing on and examining Australian sports history and sociology, I sort of like got influenced by a narrative that the playing of cricket was somehow always a demonstration of the rise of Australian nationalism. And I sort of like always found that a little bit difficult to comprehend, because when you read the history of general historians of Australian history, they talk about a very, very long period when much of Australia's examination of who they were was strongly linked to being Britishness. So I sort of like, there was a guy called, a couple of the sports historians who made a career out of saying that, you know, cricket was the first stage of Australian nationalism. And that was always perplexing because, as I told you, it went against the grain from some of our other historians. So I had some unfinished business in looking at cricket. Another thing that I was always fascinated by was the link between cricket and what I call sport as education, this concept of a sport having a central role in the independent boys' schools of Sydney. My supervisor for my PhD was an education historian called Professor Jeff Sherrington, and he always argued that the independent boys' schools were a complete transplantation of the independent boys' schools in England, as you know them as the English public schools. And therefore, cricket was central to the curriculum. The sports historians never really grappled with cricket played in the schools. They never did. They just looked at the commercial elite level cricket, which was obviously reported in the press. So that was another element to this. That was another element to this. So After COVID, we started really examining our own history and really looking at it from a colonial perspective. And the more I read about cricket in the colonial period, the more I started to realise that the story was completely incomplete, that there were a lot of things that were missed. The first thing that was missed were the schools, and I trace the playing of history back to the first real male educational institution that we had in the colony of New South Wales, and that was the old Sydney Male Orphan School. So I started doing some research on that. And of course, with everything being digital now, with a bit of hard work and a bit of grit, I sort of like worked out that the first native-born cricketers were these boys that had emerged from the Sydney Male Orphan School. It was very clear. They went there in 1818, and some of them stayed in there for 6 or 7 years. And then in the early 1830s, they formed the bulk of this very, very famous cricket team called the Australian Cricket Club. But it was very clear there that they were boys that had learnt how to play cricket in this Sydney Male Orphan School. So that was, I think, something that I've come up with, which will perhaps change the way that cricket is viewed. I then went back and had a look at the early commercial exchanges of cricket in Sydney, and they start off in 1826. And sort of like the military and the various regiments that were there start to play some games with cricketers from the home country. And there was a couple of very famous publicans at the time. Richard Driver Sr. is one. Edward Flood is another person. And I think they came to the conclusion that if you really wanted to generate interest in commercial sport, you needed to have some kind of a narrative. So I suspect what they decided to do is they said, well, a great way of generating some interest in commercial cricket is setting up matches between the home country and the native cricketers. And in about 1832, cricket really took off around that kind of the narrative. So I came to the conclusion that the establishment of the Australian Cricket Club was not really about some kind of, emergence of Australian nationalism. These were clearly commercial endeavours. So I think that's something new to the Australian colonial sporting story, that we've misunderstood this Australian Cricket Club. Why did these cricket games emerge in 1826? Well, the answer's very, very simple. From about 1810 up until 1826, horse racing is very central to sport in the colony. And it becomes so big that it is moved from Hyde Park in Sydney and taken out to Randwick. They build a custom-made race course there. And of course, there's the emergence of other race courses as well. So what happened after horse racing leaves Hyde Park is that there's no real sport going on. And that's where cricket, I think, became the sport that actually fills in the void, the space left by the horse racing. of course, there must have been a real appetite for these matches because every match that was advertised was reported in the media, and they spoke about the stake, £20, £50 matches. It was really about, generating some business. Now, in 1832, as I said, the schools are already playing. They're already playing cricket in the schools, the private venture schools, and somebody in the Sydney Morning Herald decides to advertise that the Sydney College is playing against St James's School. That we all should go down to watch. Now, that match was reported in the media, and it must have generated a bit of, there must have been some issues with a school match being promoted as some kind of an opportunity to gamble. So the following day, the editor of the newspaper came out and said that this is a game of cricket and we need to support it, but it's not for money. So it's very clear that in 1832, there's clearly two types of cricket that is going on. There's the cricket in the community, which is about commerce and money and gambling. And there's also the cricket, which is being played already in the schools. So then my final conclusion to all of this is that whether it was the school cricket that was going on or whether it was the cricket that was going out in the wider community, it was all about these individuals demonstrating their Britishness. It was nothing to do with Australian nationalism whatsoever. That's what I believe. That's what I believe. The other thing that the Australian sports historians really didn't look at was the important role that the military played in all of this. As I said, this evening I went out with the students to the Sydney cricket ground, and we had a bit of a discussion there about the Sydney cricket ground. But I said to them that it was the military that had built the cricket ground. They had called it the military ground. How does this all happen? It happens because in 1854, there's a new barracks which is built in Paddington. The previous barracks was on our main street, which was called George Street. It was built in 1810. Well, it was built a little earlier, but by 1810 it had walls around it. But then the city was getting so big and so commercial that there was pressure on them to move the barracks to a new location. And what they did is they moved it to Paddington, where it still stands. Now, below the barracks, a very famous colonel called Bloomfield, he had requested, it was sort of like an architect there, but he had requested lots of fields for a shooting range and also a cricket ground. And of course, that's our Sydney cricket ground. And of course, the shooting range is now the current site of the stadium next to the Sydney cricket ground, which is now called Allianz Stadium, which this evening was hosting a soccer football match between Sydney FC and the Western Sydney Wanderers. So I think overall I've come to the conclusion that there were clearly two types of cricket that were going on. That's the first point. The second point is, regardless of the type of cricket that was going on, it was really just about demonstrating Britishness. And of course, for some reason, sports historians, Australian sports historians, have really neglected the important role that the military played, not only in the sport of cricket, but also all of the other sports as well. Yeah, are there a couple of questions there?
So, Steve, thank you very much for joining us. We were curious actually earlier as to whether you'd been at the Sydney Derby tonight and had to nip home early.
It's good to know it was on. We took the international students there, and don't tell anyone, but I had some money on Sydney FC, so we left at half time. And the good news is, I think they're up 3-1. So it's a good night. But I should have left about 5 minutes earlier to have.
Well, thank you for breaking into the game. Anyway, it was appreciated because it's a good win by the sounds of it. But if I can just summarise what you were saying there, the clubs were created by a combination of British migrants and the military, essentially. Is that fair?
All our sports have a military foundation, all of them. Captain Piper organises the first boat races in about 1818 on Sydney Harbour as commercial pursuits. He becomes so wealthy that he buys an entire part of Sydney, which is now called Point Piper, which the houses there are in the hundreds of millions. So there's a link there. There's clearly a link with the military and horse racing, not only in Sydney, but all of the different colonies. It's very clear that the military was heavily involved there. Our fifth governor, obviously you all know a lot about our history, but we're colonised in 1788. The British arrive here, Governor Phillip. By 1810, Governor Macquarie's sent out to clean everything up. It's a mess. He's a military man. So he arrives on the 1st of January 1810. But by mid-October, he's already designated an area that he ends up calling in that first year Hyde Park. And he chisels out an area and says that this will be used for recreational purposes. And that's 1810. In October there, he organises the first horse races. And it's very interesting to me because the horse racing is obviously, it's the officers and the elite and the rich. I mean, that's clear. We all know that. But he allows the lower classes to have some kind of an input, that they're able to be involved in the gambling, that they're able to view the races. And that happens in 1810. And like I said, that was the 73rd Regiment which organised those horse races. It was unheard of then. I mean, there were hardly any horses in Sydney at the time. Now, if you have a look at the other horse racing which goes on in Australia as well, it's done by the military and ex-military people. They form the first turf clubs. They form all the major racing in the various colonies. So that's very clear there. The boating and rowing and yachting are also very important because that's the way that people move around the harbour. So that also becomes a pretty big sport. But alongside that, in the schools, there's the cricket that's going on, which is, transplanted from the English public school system. Like, that's very, very clear. Now, when it emerges in the community, like I said, the military are always playing cricket. They're playing cricket inside the George Street barracks, but then in 1826 they emerge at Hyde Park. But it never really takes off. Like, that's the important thing here. From 1826 until 1832, there are references to games, but nothing much is happening until Edward Flood takes over the Australian Hotel, and Richard Driver takes on another hotel, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name of the hotel. And then I think they get together and say, look, how are we going to make this work? How are we going to demonstrate some entertainment? And they come up with a concept of, British versus the natives, and they go under different names. And it generates a lot of interest. The military still plays matches, but I suspect there would have been issues with gambling that was going on that I can't understand at the moment. So in many ways, they don't take part in the big high-stake games. And this, I believe, continues. And then there are more clubs established. Now, there are more clubs established for two very good reasons. The first reason is that there are more free settlers arriving. There are more British immigrants who are familiar with cricket, so of course they take up cricket. But a lot of the players have already played cricket in the schools, and then they play in the community. Like, it's very clear. The prime example I can give here is that in the colonial period of Australia, there's one family that really stands out, and it's the Gregory family. The tour guide today at the Sydney Cricket Ground mentioned his name 3 or 4 times. The grandfather, the patriarch of the family there, Edward Gregory, was an orphan. And from his knowledge of cricket being learnt at the orphanage, we had this dynasty of Gregorys who went on to captain colonial teams. I don't know how many of them ended up captaining New South Wales teams. So there's a clear example. But the point I'm trying to make is what the sports historians misunderstood in Australia is cricket is learned in schools. You don't learn it as a 20-year-old, if you miss that critical period of not learning it in schools, you never develop, an appetite for the game. My kids have missed that, unfortunately, and they've got absolutely no interest in cricket at all. So that's what I think was an important part that people like Richard Cashman and other sports historians never understood. They were always dismissive of it. But what do we know? We know schools in Adelaide like St. Peter's College and Hale School in Perth, Melbourne Grammar and Scotch College in England. They were the nurseries of cricket. But not only that, by the 1860s or the late 1850s, it was the schools that played football first. Like, that's another thing which was completely missed. Sports historians then talk about, this ridiculous notion. It infuriates me. And Phil Heads, who was the tour guide today, his father was this amazing rugby league historian, and his son Phil is a lovely guy, and he opened up the Sydney Cricket Ground for us. But he looked at the Sydney Cricket Ground and he goes, well, as you know, the Sydney Swans play here, and, Australian rules football was a game invented to keep cricketers fit. Well, it's rubbish. It's nothing like that. football emerges because football is big in the schools in the back in England, in the home country, and we need to prove that we're also British and we want to do things better. So it's no surprising that football is the next big sport that is played in the schools. So we have this tradition of football in the winter and cricket in the summer. But the point I want to make is, who are the players that are then playing in commercial cricket? They are the boys who have learnt to play back in England or here in Australia in the independent boys' schools. And that I think is a major oversight. A couple of questions about that.
Yeah, I suppose I have one. Why have the schools been overlooked? They don't come up at all in Prof. Mandel's foundational text. There is, as you say, very little about them in Richard Cashman's great book, otherwise great book, Paradise of Sport. Is it purely because they're viewed as a lesser form of sporting endeavor, by definition unprofessional, because they're played by boys?
I don't want to be repetitive, but like I said, when I was in that history society, I'm here listening to them talking about stuff, and I'm thinking, where did Bradman learn to play cricket? Why is it that all of these players of the Norwood Cricket Club all went to Prince Alfred College? Right? Now, the question is, am I a smart person? And my answer to you would be, I'm okay, I think. Like, I've got a pretty critical mind. Is Richard Cashman and Mandel smarter than me? And the answer is yes. So they would have known that this was the case, right? They would have known. Of course they would have known. They would have known. They would have read the work by people such as Mangan talking about cricket and football taking place in the English public schools. They would have known that these schools in Australia were more British than these schools. So my answer, and I sort of like hinted at it in the book, is it went against their narrative. And their narrative always was popular sport, was working class, and it was about Australian nationalism, and Mandel was right there with, looking at issues of Australian nationalism. I think they got it wrong. And to be honest with you, I believe they must have known that they got it wrong, but it went against their narrative. Really went against their narrative. Now, I also believe that because Tony Collins, whose work really changed my whole meaning. I mean, I read his stuff and I thought, oh my God, he's got the answer. Of course, Australian rules football was a demonstration of, a demonstration of Britishness. There's no such thing as Australia. How could it be Australia? These guys simply came up with some rules to make the game a little more commercial. That's all that happened there. And there were a couple of people in the founding of even Australian rules football who were really heavily involved in the football that was going on in Melbourne Grammar and Scots College. So clearly the football emerges before the community stuff as well. But to admit that Melbourne Grammar and Scots College and all these people were central to the founding of Australian rules football gets you into a lot of trouble, gets you into a lot of trouble. And they went after Tony Collins when he started writing about Australian rules football being, a demonstration of Britishness. But Tony was completely right, and I had communicated to him out of the blue, a couple of times, and I said, look, dear Tony, you don't know me, but I've read your work, and you're 100% right. And we had some correspondence, and he encouraged me to publish the book that I ended up publishing. But he too never looked at the schools when he wrote about Australian rules football. He just said it was a demonstration of British nationalism, but then never really looked at the role that the schools played. And I think I've done that in my book there, and I thank Rodney there for picking up on that theme. Now, a couple of people that I've spoken to about this, including a very famous spinner, Greg Matthews. I'd have chats to him about this stuff. I went to the pub with him, and I bought him a beer there, and I was speaking to him about the thesis about this thing, and he got very angry. He says, "Well, what are you talking about?" He says, we've always hated the English, He says it can't be right, Australian cricket was about Australianness and stuff like that. It was in his period, but clearly in earlier periods it was not that at all. Anyway, Ian Chappell was a fanatical Australian who was always always very anti-English and stuff like that. And I remember when I was doing my research a few years ago, he was on radio and he was saying how he travels back to England now, and he's found the graves of his ancestors, and it was really touching and all of this kind of stuff, So it got me, reflecting on it a bit.
I suppose I'd invite further questions. If no one has one, I do. Yes, Brian.
It's very interesting. It's a bit like, I was thinking it's a bit like the Irish and the Americans. That was they started the cricket through the military, and then they gave it up because it was British, and they didn't want that. They wanted to be separate. Now Australia's gone the other way, really. Any particular reason why that is the case?
Look, I love my history, and like I said, I started looking at soccer football in Australia and this concept of ethnic soccer, and the Australian sports historians were talking about how when immigrants came to Australia and played soccer, they were maintaining their ethnic background. It perhaps was true for a couple of the ethnic groups, but then actually I looked at it and said, well, actually, what they were doing was that they were doing exactly what Australianness was about, which was playing sport. So then I argued that in this period when we have mass immigration, I mean, someone like my father's not going to be loyal to the Queen, right? You've got to bring people together, and the decision that we made in the 1950s was to use the institution of sport to bring all of us together, a much more diverse group. I'm the son of a second generation Greek, and I'm as Australian as you can possibly be, even though I've got a Greek name. Now, what made me Australian was the playing of sport. So it assimilated us, whether you were boys or girls, whatever. It was the great definer. Now, in the colonial period, right, it's very clear there that if you want to make it in the colonial period, right, you've got to involve yourself in the British institutions, right? That's very clear. Edward Flood, right, who established the Australian Cricket Club, became the mayor of Sydney, became very wealthy, was the son of an illegitimate Irish convict. So to answer your question, this is my rationale. The British come here and they don't want another US. They really don't, right? They really don't. And so they say, well, okay, how are we going to keep everyone British? And I think what they decide to do is they make sure that they use certain institutions to keep people British. Another example in the colonial period was the establishment of bowling clubs. By the year 1900, there are 117 clubs which are only allowed to have liquor licenses, and the majority of those are sporting clubs, including a number of bowling clubs. So the Irish came here, and I think what happened was they came to a decision a little bit like my own father did, 50 or 60 years ago. And he said, look, I could be a proud Greek, but actually I want to have success in this country. And I think that's what they did. To make it in our world, there was some kind of a code that needed to be adhered to. It involved going to schools and boys knowing to play sport. Our entertainment involved around going to the races, going to play and watch football, and play and watch cricket. So sport became that institution that was the definer of Britishness in Australia. And all of these people of influence were in some way associated with sport. That's very clear. Now, the military are always going to be central to this because really they are the definers of the society. They set the parameters on how things work. And Governor Macquarie, who was here from only 1810 up until 1822, set us on that path. The Sydney Cricket Ground is located on something which is called the Sydney Common. And he sort of like carved out the area and said, you're not going to develop this area. This will eventually be, somewhere where we can have, recreation going on. In 1810, Macquarie's son is at the age of going to school. I can't tell you how old he was. And he writes to the Sydney Lumberyard in 1821. He would have known that his tenure at Sydney was coming to an end, but his son had that 1 year where he went into school. And he wrote a letter to the Sydney Lumberyard and said, dear whatever, can you make 12 dozen bats? And once my 12 dozen bats for so-and-so's school, once my son leaves this school, the bats will belong to the school. So he sets it in motion. The 73rd Regiment, which was involved in the horse racing here, had already been racing in India. So sport becomes that institution which is really privileged. It's where the connections are all made, and you're allowed to make it in Sydney society, providing you're able to, maneuver yourself in that, commercial world. That's what I think. Edward Flood, in all of his writings there and stuff, nobody ever notes that he was at the orphan school. So my point to you is that clearly the US was lost, and there was the fear there that they needed to keep this as British as they possibly can. They come to Sydney first, and then they go to Tasmania. Why do they go to Tasmania? They go to Tasmania because there's a great fear that the French are manoeuvring for Tasmania. So they set up shop there. 1810, the horse races take place here in October in Sydney. Soon afterwards, they take place in Hobart. So that's the role of sport. In 1854, why does Bloomfield advocate for a cricket ground and a shooting range at the barracks? He does so because there's a directive in the British Empire that all garrisons and barracks need to have cricket grounds built. It's very clear. Who's the threat in 1854? Well, the threat is the Russians. So they start preparing for maybe a Russian invasion, but they want to hold on to Australia. What always amazes me is how many regimental soldiers ended up serving in Australia, and the number was very small. The British came here and took complete control of the land by simply advocating and mandating their institutions. That's what I think I've come up with.
Well, thanks, Brian, for an excellent question, and thanks, Steve, for an excellent answer. And not least because it's answered a question that's long puzzled me. Australia, of course, had and has itself a substantial Irish population. It's always been surprising to me how thoroughly that population, which you wouldn't think predisposed, bought into the phenomenon you described. You know, 4 of Australia's inaugural Test cricketers had Irish backgrounds. Australia's first great sports journalist, too, was Irish to the core. Any other questions? Okay, well, I think I have one to conclude. I think it's fair to say that you take another dig in both your presentation here and in your book at what's been called the radical nationalist tradition of Australian historiography, into which, of course, Mandel and Cashman's work fits very snugly. It's difficult to square the idea of sport in colonial Australia as a vector for British nationalism and British cultural hegemony with the idea that it fostered any sort of Republican sensibility, which seems to be the assumption that that tradition has. Why do you think the radical nationalist tradition has been so persistent, if not in academia, and I think it still is pretty persistent there, than in the popular
Australian
conception?
nationalist or British?
Well, you emphasise that sport in colonial Australia was more a vector for British race nationalism, as it were,
Yep.
whereas the old radical nationalist tradition tended to assume that it gave rise to federation, as it were, and a republican sentiment made Australians aware of themselves as Australians as opposed to exported Brits.
At the end of the Second World War, there was a massive Gallup poll that was done, and I think in those days they were quite, forgetting my terms here, they were quite authoritative, but actually they were real polls, and they said that in the late 40s, before the influence of mass migration to Australia, it's still quite a Anglo-Celtic British area. They asked the people, you know, do you feel British or do you feel Australian or something similar to that? And 70% of the people felt that in the late 1940s that they were more British than they were Australian. So what is federation? I mean, federation is Western Australia with a lot of mineral wealth, perhaps becoming an independent nation, right? Australia's full of 50,000 or 60,000 Chinese background people. So federation in many ways is a way of course, Australians becoming Australians, but in many ways it's keeping keeping the nation more British. I mean, the first policy that's invoked is the White Australia policy itself, which, if you're saying that you're becoming a republic and you're open to, to having an Australian type of nationalism, well, you've thrown out a significant number of your non-white population. What do we do in 1915? It's quite extraordinary that people en masse go and fight for the empire. Like that's a fact. What happens in 85? We organised troops to go and fight in Sudan. So they got it wrong. They got it wrong. I still think using nationalism is a very good way of understanding our society. People talk about, Irish nationalism in the colonial period. The truth of the matter is, the two biggest Catholic schools, the two most important Catholic schools, were rugby playing schools in Sydney. They wanted to fit into the establishment. They weren't interested in establishing Gaelic football or playing other forms of football. They were telling the rest of the society that we were trying to be a part of it all. So I think sometimes people make too much of this issue. Just finally, before I go, as you know, my background's Greek, and we had relatives all over the world, in the US and in South Africa and all of these places, and when we get together, we have this amazing rivalry between ourselves, and the rivalry has always manifested itself in sport. And a rivalry in sport, or booing an opponent who's English, is not you. It's a simplistic way of saying, well, see, we wanted to be, this was the first sign of Australian nationalism. I think it's the complete opposite. It's you telling the home country that you are British. Melbourne must have been richer than London in the 1860s and 1870s. And they demonstrate their Britishness by setting up all these magnificent sporting fields, including the Melbourne Cricket Ground and the horse racing. So I think they got that wrong. I really do. Now, where does Australian nationalism really come in? I think it comes in quite late, and it comes in when it's very clear that the British are no longer coming here in large numbers. There's a lot more diversity in the community, but it's still sport, which is the signifier or the institution which generates the nationalism. And that happens clearly in the 1956 Olympic Games. Fourth in the world, okay, that's impressive. But what is even more impressive is that at all of the different school levels, including the public and private, it's that institution of sport which is really promoted as being this great assimilator. You play sport in school. If you're good enough, you play for the elite clubs at the senior level, but you involve yourself in sport. You go to the races. You gamble. And it's these institutions which initially made you British, but that ultimately made you, it was used for Australian nationalism.
All right. Well, I think that's a very provocative and interesting note on which to end. I'm sure everyone's got places to be. I'm sure you've got a bed to get to. Thanks again for...
No, I just need a glass of water there,
All right. Okay. Well, I myself have an appointment with old Deuteronomy and Rumpelteazer and other confections of Andrew Lloyd Webber, so I need to be going myself. Thanks again for your time, Professor, and thanks to everyone for attending. Please do send your feedback to the membership secretary if you have any suggestions, future guests, structure, etc. And I hope we all meet again soon. Goodbye, everyone.